Science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition. Hi, I'm Juliette Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote, named for Adam Smith, brought to you by Liberty Fund. To learn more, visit www.adamsmithworks.org. Welcome back. Today, on October 4th, 2022, I'm excited to be talking to Rachel Ferguson about her new book, Black Liberation Through the Marketplace, Hope, Heartbreak, and the Promise of America, which is co-authored with Marcus N. Witcher. She's an economic philosopher, awesome title, at Concordia University, Chicago, and there she's the director of the Free Enterprise Center. She's also an affiliate scholar at the Acton Institute. This book, guys, is so awesome because it wraps up so many things into one. You learn about classical liberalism and some of the key thinkers. You learn about how Black liberation goes hand in hand with the marketplace. You learn about how classical liberals have given different solutions to systemic oppression of African Americans. You learn about civil society. I'm excited to talk about this. Welcome.
Wow, thank you. That was quite a recommendation.
Yeah, I mean, I liked it. So what is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
Well, you may cover this kind of thing a lot on your show, but I think a lot of people your age are actually unaware of sort of how great it is today. So there's a lot of pessimism. It's almost like we're so luxurious, we don't realize how luxurious we are. And so one thing I always try to tell my students is, hey, guys, we're living in the richest, safest time in the history of the world, in an age of medical miracles, of, luxury like our ancestors just 3 or 4 generations ago just couldn't have even dreamed, in terms of being able to fly across the world and travel and do amazing things and live till we're 95, And so, I think it's easy to get caught up in a lot of the news stories about how, millennials can't afford a house. Well, what they mean is they can't afford a 2,000 square foot house like the ones their parents have now. But they certainly can afford the kind of house that their parents got in the 1970s, right? A little 700 square foot house with laminate floors. It's just that nobody wants that anymore because our standards have gone up. So I think it just helps to get some perspective to realize just how well off we really are comparatively to the rest of history. And we have our struggles, but we need to stay in reality about that.
Yeah, I'm a big optimist, but there are a lot of pessimists out there.
Oh, yeah.
Even when you look at the facts, there's so many good books or websites, like gapminder.org has a lot of good, you can visually see.
Humanprogress.org is another good one.
Yeah, and I remember at the beginning of Principles of Macro, one of my professors, he put up this graph with figures on it, along with the economic growth and population growth graphs. And it's crazy. You see it's like Jesus, Thomas Jefferson, and then there's us. And it's just, it's miles apart, even though in the scheme of even human existence, us to Thomas Jefferson was not that long. It's crazy.
It's crazy.
So check out a visual.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people maybe listening right now might think, well, that may be true in America, but what about in the rest of the world? And it's no, we're talking about the global marketplace and the fact that, for instance, abject poverty, which has been typical for human life, living under $3 a day for most of history, is now down to 8%. I mean, most people think poverty in the world is getting worse. It's totally false. It's getting much, much better overall. We may have seen a blip of it going down with COVID, but the general trajectory is very, very fast, getting a lot richer.
So let's jump into those marketplaces. What brought this issue to you, and why write this book now?
Yeah, great question. I mean, there's a lot of ways I could answer that question because I do have a background that made me sort of sensitive to the plight of Black Americans. I grew up in an extremely diverse background, even in my own household. So I had foster brothers who were from the inner city, in and out of the criminal justice system, lots of struggles. And so in the back of my mind, it was sort of always there as a kind of nagging question that needed to be answered. And I knew that the the typical sort of progressive social engineering kind of plans for Black Americans, particularly those in the inner city, were not working. I knew that they wouldn't work. And that's part of, being in the classical liberal tradition and understanding the problems with central planning. And so I thought, well, what will work? But I just had it sort of back there nagging until Ferguson blew up in St. Louis. And we had a huge amount of civil unrest over the course of a couple of nights. And of course, it made national news. Ferguson is very close to my house and close to the university that I was at the time. And as I got more involved in criminal justice reform efforts and other sort of classical liberal approaches in Ferguson, I began to talk to students and to fellow faculty about all of the classical liberal insights that exist on race and discrimination. A lot of people don't think of us as really being a good source, for those kinds of insights, but we really are. I mean, there's some amazing insights about the history of the minimum wage and others that people weren't aware of. So as I put together a series of lectures on this for my students and other things, slowly but surely, people started saying, you need to write this up. This needs to all be put together in one place where people can see that there's this sort of pro-Black classical liberal legacy. And it's a great way of breaking up some of the sort of tribal polarized conversations we're having that are way too simplistic right now in our political conversation. And so I'm really hoping that it'll kind of break open that conversation and be a third way and be refreshing for people to have a different way to approach these very hot topics.
And there's not really another book like it. You guys explained that it's an anti-tribal project of ideological unbundling. The word unbundling reminds me immediately of consumption bundle from econ, but also like public choice and voting. That's how we look at voters' preferences a lot of the time. But like, can you unpack what that entire phrase means for us?
Yeah, and you may have some great challenges for me on this, because the truth is that I'm not a political scientist and I'm not an economist. I'm a philosopher, which means that my first job in my own mind is to figure out what's real and what's true, right? And so I need to take every issue that arises on its own. I need to consider it by itself, not just as a plank in somebody's party platform. And philosophers are allowed to think outside of the box, I guess I would say, and to think with what I might call moral imagination. Yeah, things might be presented a certain way right now, but that doesn't mean that's how they have to be presented or how they have to be bundled together. And so one thing we notice when we look at party platforms is that oftentimes there are things that go together that didn't used to go together, or that don't have to go together, or that don't go together philosophically. And I certainly feel that way as someone running in libertarian and classical liberal circles, because we've always I shouldn't say borrowed, but we've agreed with one side on some things. Let's say we've agreed with conservatives on fiscal conservatism, but we've agreed with the other side on other things, like our sensitivity to things like the failures of the drug war or the problems of mass incarceration. And so I wanted to sort of give the readers permission to let go of those loyalties for a moment and to think of each of these issues one at a time. So that's what I mean by unbundling. Think of these issues one at a time and think about what it would do to bring a certain set of political principles, and I offer classical liberal ones as an example, to these different issues, and notice that it brings us to very different conclusions from what the party platforms would have us see.
It's crazy. No, not even crazy. It's funny that you say that I could push back on that, because we just got finished with this unit of learning about voting and like how we model voting and how we look at that in the public choice realm. With econ. And it's interesting because you can either look at a graph where on each axis you have the amount of spending or the amount of like a service you want. So like a policy on either axis, or you can look at an axis where you have on one end, it's like the amount of government intervention, for example, that a lot of models base themselves off of that. And it's funny because for me, being libertarian and classical liberal, I'm like, oh, well, pretty close to zero. And everyone, and then I'm thinking about it and I'm like, I don't understand how other people don't see this as calling out the contradiction in their political philosophies, because I don't know, at least I'm consistent across the board. And maybe that's because looking at it in terms of how much government intervention just goes along with how I think about this sort of stuff. But to me, it just seemed like a weird way to model it, because that's not how the majority of people think in their policy prescriptions and things like that. So I like the unbundling idea.
I think formerly, that we used to say 20 years ago, I don't know if they say this anymore in libertarian circles, but we used to say, we're fiscally conservative and socially liberal or something like that. And so we would have seen the left as being high on government intervention when it comes to the economy, and the right is being high on government intervention when it comes to your personal life. But as we can see now, both sides are very high on government intervention on both areas. They just want to forward different views of how society should look. So I mean, yeah,
I don't know. I haven't heard anyone say that in the past 3 or 4 years, but I don't think it entirely. I don't know. I've also shifted away, and I just call myself a classical liberal entirely now. So maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I did the same thing, so we can talk about it.
Yeah, so what do you mean? What does that mean? What do we mean?
Well, what is it? I used to use the term libertarian to refer to myself, and I might say it still now sometimes, but mostly I call myself a classical liberal. And part of the reason for that is that I think the term libertarian might indicate, or at least over time has become maybe oversimplified. And so the idea is that you just hate the state. It's just anti-statism. Well, first of all, the classical liberal tradition has a minimal state. And since it has a minimal state, it has a theory of the state. It has a theory of government. It has ideas about good statesmanship that you get from little r republicanism. And you see this in our founders. You see this in Adam Smith. You see this in David Hume. Okay, and so the tradition is not totally anti-state. It's just that you have a minimal government. And so you want to be on your guard, for government growth. And the other issue is that there's a huge emphasis in the classical liberal tradition on virtue. And that really not only statesmen, but people need to be virtuous to be free. If you are not a virtuous society, you probably won't maintain your freedoms. And that's made very clear by all the founders. It's something they all agreed on. And so now what you see sometimes is a libertarianism that's more like a libertinism. As long as I am not violently harming you, you cannot even comment on what I'm doing. That is ridiculous. I mean, the whole idea of having a culture is that we debate and discuss what is appropriate about the way that we live our lives. And particularly if we want government to be minimal, then we need to be policing ourselves through moral shame and praise. And so I think it's really important to have that. That's what I talk about, thick civil society institutions in the book, because that's where we really live our lives, is in a very deeply morally rich kind of environment, and not one that has such a simple, there's one rule, the non-aggression principle, that's supposed to answer every question. It doesn't answer every question. It answers a very basic set of questions, and then you need a lot more to draw on.
I learned the other day that people refer to the non-aggression principle as the NAP.
Yes.
And I was so confused. I was in a conversation with this dude, and he was like, oh, the NAP, this violates the NAP, the NAP, the NAP, the NAP. And I was like, what the heck is the NAP? I had to look it up afterwards. And I was like, oh, I guess I live under a rock or something. I don't know. So we'll get into civil society and how it fits in more a little bit later. But first, what is your definition of social justice?
Well, it's not so much that I have a definition as that I have a conversation about the definitions.
Yeah, let's get into some semantics maybe.
Yeah,
and talk about it.
Isn't it? That's absolutely right.
It matters.
It matters to take into account who you're talking to. So when Friedrich Hayek says in the Constitution of Liberty, he's got a volume called The Mirage of Social Justice. And he's absolutely right, given the definition of social justice that he uses, which is that social justice has to do with trying to control what the outcome will be of our economic exchanges, and mostly wanting them to be fairly equal. And he's saying this is a mirage. It's a dream. You can't do it. You can't control the outcomes at all, number one, and you can't make them equal. And he's absolutely right about that. And actually, it's very, very dangerous to undertake this view of social justice because it requires a totalitarian state to bring about that kind of equality of outcome. And even then, it doesn't work, but that's what you're always tempted to do. And so it's no wonder that some people are so reactive about the term social justice because they're thinking of it in that way. And that is what some people have meant by it. But I think when I talk to my neighbors, when people at my church use the term social justice, even just non-philosophers, right? People at my work who just say, oh, it's that person cares about social justice. Oftentimes what they mean is not any particular political ideology. It's not necessarily equality of outcome. In many cases, it means something like there are people who are voiceless. There are people who have been historically oppressed. We need to put special energy into standing up for them. And you know what? That's true. You can't argue with that. That is absolutely true. There are people whose voices have been suppressed. There are people who, if you think about our criminal justice system, for instance, who do not have the kind of access to really stand up for themselves in that system and can be mowed over by technicalities or by bureaucracy. And so do we have to put extra energy into standing up for those people? Yes, we do. Do we have to do that always through the state? No, that may not be the best way to do it. But that's where the debate should be. So the debate shouldn't be, do we care about the marginalized or not? Of course, we care about the marginalized. The debate should be, how do we best serve the marginalized? And that's where you get, I think, the debate between more progressives and conservatives.
And you explain in the book that contrary to the common belief about this, that free market people and classical liberal thinkers have historically been super supportive of the struggle of Black liberation in America. How have classical liberals gone about thinking about this sort of thing, and how have they critiqued the treatment of African Americans in America?
Yeah, this was actually a really wonderful thing to discover in my research, because I think maybe passively, without having given it too much thought, I sort of had the impression that we haven't been that great on race. That classical liberals have been too concerned about, nitpicking about the Constitution or something. And so we haven't always stood up for Black rights. But it turns out that there's actually quite a tradition of pro-Black classical liberalism in the United States, and actually a tradition that made a big difference, which is really encouraging. So number one, the first point I want to make is that the founders were quite split on slavery. I mean, you really don't want to take the sort of hyper racism that you see in the 19th century and apply it to the 18th century. That wasn't so much the case. You had plenty of people were racist. I'm not saying they weren't, but you had plenty of serious moral concern about slavery, the sense that it really was incompatible with a free society, that we would have to deal with it in the United States, or it would spell the doom of our republic. It was probably the biggest debate at the Constitutional Convention. And many of our founders were heads of abolitionist societies. I mean, it was really, really controversial. Lots of anti-federalists also were saying, the reason they didn't want to sign up for the Constitution is because it was a compromise with slavers. And so there was a lot of serious moral debate over this that I think was coming from a very classical liberal place. The notion that we are all created equal. And we do have inalienable rights given to us by our creator. So that's the first point. But the second point is that actually a big chunk of the abolitionist movement were classical liberals. And I didn't even know this. We've all heard of William Lloyd Garrison and his famous newspaper, The Liberator. It was so important. There was a whole gaggle of these guys, and they were all followers of Richard Cobden in England, who was a big free trader. And for him, being anti-slavery and being free trade all flowed from the same commitment to a kind of Christian pacifism. And the idea was that whenever you can avoid coercion, you should. So that means I'm against the Corn Laws and I'm against slavery because they're both coercive, And William Lloyd Garrison actually said he wanted to close down every tariff house in the world. I mean, he was a very extreme free trader. And so it was really interesting to see how that passion for free trade went right along with his passion for abolitionism. Of course, his student, or a person who became his student, Frederick Douglass, initially agreed with Garrison's condemnation of the Constitution because of its compromise with slavers. But it was actually another libertarian thinker, Lysander Spooner, who changed Douglass's mind. And Lysander Spooner said, you know what? You should just read the Constitution like a contract and hold people to their word. What are the words in the Constitution? And so Douglass said, you know what? He's right. The Constitution is a great liberty document. And the issue isn't the Constitution. It's whether or not Americans have honor enough and courage enough to live up to their Constitution. So you have this incredible abolitionist movement that's classical liberal in nature. And then as we move into the 20th century, you see in the very early 20th century with the founding of the NAACP, several of the major co-founders, including one of the first co-presidents of the NAACP, were classical liberals, Moorfield Story and Oswald Garrison Villard. And these guys were saying, hey, look, we have a classical liberal, freedom-oriented system of government. And if we will use our courts through lawsuits, we can achieve rights for Black Americans because they're there in the text. And so that's what motivated a lot of what the NAACP was doing. And then another one, I won't go on and on, but another one the audience just has to know about is Rose Wilder Lane, the daughter of Laura Ingalls Wilder, because she's considered one of the three mothers of libertarianism. And she actually was a communist, but she went to the USSR and changed her mind. She came home a libertarian, and she ended up working for the Pittsburgh Courier, which is one of the biggest it was the biggest Black newspaper in the United States, trying to make white people aware of the domestic terrorism of lynching, arguing against zoning, making all sorts of libertarian individual rights style arguments for the freedom of Black Americans. And so I could go on, but it's just really neat to see that strand was there and quite strong.
Wait, that was one of my favorite things in the entire book. I mean, the book was awesome, but I'm just going to read it. So when she went to Russia, there was a guy who said, quote, "In Moscow, there are only men, and man is not God. A man has only a man's head, and 100 heads together do not make one great head." I laughed for like 5 minutes. I don't know why. I thought it was so funny. I was like, that's such a good point. Like, obviously in my head, there's like implicitly this understanding, but to hear someone connect the dots like that, I just couldn't deal with it. So that's funny.
Oh, but that quote is genius. It's almost like he's explaining the information problem.
On the constitutional question, I've asked a few people about this because I just find it so fascinating. Where do you fall? Is the Constitution a pro-slavery document, or is it pro-liberty, or somewhere in between?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of evidence to say that it's a pro-liberty document. For instance, Madison demanded that the term slavery not be included in the document, for the very reason that he did not want anyone to get the impression from this document that you could have property in human beings. So even though there was a ascribed right to own other human beings, there was no natural right to own other human beings. And it was, I think, very clear, and you can see this in the historical documents, that they were really hoping that slavery would either fade away through economic changes. And that was actually not entirely unrealistic at that point. This was before the invention of the cotton gin. The idea that we could just sort of peacefully shift out of slavery. The cotton gin kind of changed that, but that was the idea. Or that the next generation would be able to untangle this problem and get rid of it. But the point is that the founders knew that it had to go. And you also see Jefferson saying things like in 1820 with the Missouri Compromise, this is it. It's the beginning of the end of the country. In other words, they all saw slavery as the one fatal flaw, and that if it wasn't addressed, the country couldn't last. And so for that reason, I think they tried everything they could to build liberty into the Constitution in such a way that within a generation or two, slavery could be addressed. And things just didn't progress that way historically, sadly, and it took longer than 2 generations, but it was eventually addressed.
So was it just the cotton gin that led to a lot of these natural right guys, free thinker people, thinking that the institution would collapse on its own? Or was there something else there? That's what really surprised me, is that they thought it would just fall apart.
Yeah, and I don't think it should be as surprising as it sounds, because if you are reading Adam Smith, for instance, which some of them were, then you are thinking, and you may even just be thinking like him, because various people are reflecting on political economy at this time, then you are kind of understanding his argument, which is that any system which is limiting the ability of people to improve their human capital, to move to where their labor is most needed, to invent and exchange things, is really losing out, right? There's something about slavery that's just extraction rather than production. And so I think it made sense to them that because it's not really economically a system that makes a lot of sense, maybe we could work our way out of it somehow, right? And we could find a way to shift to wage labor or something where people can be incentivized, right, by the possibility of actually gaining something from harder work or cleverer work. And it was more the invention of the cotton gin later that actually just made a kind of entrenched slavery in a way, because it made it a little more efficient and it made it harder to break out of.
So in the book, you make a distinction between individual racism and state racism. What's the difference between the two, and how do they relate to each other?
Yeah, I mean, this is really important because, it's absolutely a given that the periods we are speaking in, racism gets worse in the 19th century, much worse. But everybody's racist. The abolitionists are racist. They're all racist in a sense that they think that white people are superior to Black people. And so this is totally a given. And yet, when you have a system of government that protects people's rights, people can make progress. And you see this with chapter 3, where I talk about Black people and their desire to own property. You see this with simply their ability to move. Just the ability to move is so powerful, because they can now move from one farm to the other and bid their wages up. They can move from the lower South to the upper South, where they are going to be treated better. Just the ability to move is a huge amount of freedom. And so the point is that individual racism costs you something, and this is the great insight of Gary Becker, right? Individual racism costs you something in the market, because if you don't want to hire a Black worker, then you've got to pay somebody else more. If you don't want to sell to Black people, then you lose those customers, right? It's always going to cost you something. Maybe you're willing to pay, and many people were, but it is going to cost you something. Where if the state participates in the racism, right? If you can get the municipal and state and federal laws to help you by forbidding anyone from selling to those Black customers, any white businesses, or by forbidding anyone, like the unions did, from hiring Black workers, then you don't have to pay the cost alone, right? Everybody else is paying it too. And so you have now subsidized your own racism by getting the state to enforce it. And that's a completely different situation, because individual racism you can chip away at through economic cooperation. I don't mean economic cooperation solves everything, but it can take you pretty far. But if you have the state subsidizing your individual racism, then it actually allows it to deepen in ways that are very, very evil and have terrible, long-standing consequences for the United States.
It's interesting because Thomas Sowell kind of talks about this as well. He points out that in South Africa during apartheid, a lot of whites would go behind the back of the government just to hire Blacks, because economically it wasn't sustainable, even though it was subsidized, if we say it like that. Which it's just interesting that they would actually hire them. But then again, they were paid to work beforehand. They weren't just owned the way things were in the United States.
Well,
so it's
but I mean,
different.
you do, and a lot of what I'm talking about here is less slavery, but after slavery, right? Where you have Jim Crow and you have the Black codes and you have convict leasing and all forms of oppression that become kind of a hodgepodge of laws as opposed to just being enslaved. And you actually see businesses pushing back on them, right? You see the trains and streetcars pushing back and saying, we don't want to have a separate train for Black people. Do you know how expensive that is? Do you know how alienating that is to our customers, our Black customers? We don't want to do this. Stop making us do this. And so they try to push back, but they're voted down.
Yeah, I mean, wasn't Plessy v. Ferguson done in part because the train company didn't want to have to deal with it anymore? Like, it was set up because they thought the ruling would fall one way?
Yeah, that's right. They wanted out of this deal because it was nothing but higher costs for them. And if you look at the section in my book on unionization, you can see the same thing. I think there's a popular idea that employers tried to set Black workers and white workers against one another or something like that. In order to break, because there's this idea that, employers wanted to break up their class solidarity. But that is not what happened. There is no evidence for that. The evidence is that the unions tried to exclude Black workers so that they could shove up their own wages by making it illegal for or impossible for employers to hire Blacks. And many times employers desperately wanted to hire Black people, and Black people found their greatest ally in employers, in capitalists. And so we see a very, very different story coming out of the actual historical research than what you're often presented from this sort of bourgeois versus proletariat story that we often get.
So in the face of the enormity of these offenses, slavery, Jim Crow, separate but equal, that were committed by the state and also the people who supported those policies, what do classical liberals have to offer in terms of correcting this stuff?
Yeah, it's a really good question because, of course, the ideal classical liberal solution would be that it would be illegal for municipalities and states to interfere in the contracts that you make with other people. And that was actually undertaken by the Lochner Court, Lochner, the Lochner Court in the early 20th century, that really just treated economic liberty exactly like civil liberty. And they were sort of freedom of contract absolutists, the way we might talk about freedom of speech absolutists. If you wanted to say that people weren't allowed to work over a certain number of hours a week, that Supreme Court ruled against that. They said people can make whatever contracts they want. It's none of your business. And so that's an interesting debate, though, because if you do that, if you have that kind of view, then what about localism? What about federalism? What about the things that localities and states may want to do that are a little more shaping of the society or of the environment than what we would think the central government is free to do? So there's a fair debate over that. But yeah, I mean, in a perfect world, people's contract rights could not be abrogated, or at least they couldn't to that extent. A lot of those kinds of laws were racist in origin. So for instance, when people said, we want to zone this area so that there can't be laundries here or something like that, it wasn't because they wanted single family homes in a pristine neighborhood. It's because they didn't want Chinese laundries. Okay. It's because they were anti-Chinese. And if you go back in the 1880s and you look at a lot of those types of cases, you can see that racism at play. And so it's not that the Supreme Court in the Lochner era was so enlightened when it came to racism. It's just that they believed in freedom of contract. And so that would have been great, but it didn't go through. It ended up, that court was overturned later, and people began to start passing the wage and hour laws and all of those sorts of laws. And so Jim Crow laws were upheld where they really should have been, I think, knocked down and made impossible. Even if the NAACP had been able to pursue that legal route, it would have been really interesting to see what happened. But early on in the NAACP, they didn't have the level of funding they needed to do that. And by the time they did have more funding, the Lochner Court had already been overturned. So what do we say now, right? So we're stuck with a situation in which we're arguing over the 1964 Anti-Discrimination Act. And I think I have a couple of things to say. The first would be, listen, don't necessarily think of private property rights as some kind of hyper-rationalist Enlightenment way. Think of them as an inheritance from the common law tradition. And in the common law tradition, you did have the idea that you served, if you were a public-facing store, you served anybody who wasn't being a disturbance. And that's actually passed down from hundreds of years before even the founding of the United States. And so the idea that that's a violation of your property right, to say that you have to serve whoever, all comers, isn't really true. It's not really a part of the tradition of property rights as they've operated over hundreds and hundreds of years. And so I would say that. And then the other thing I would say is, if we did, in a sense, violate people's right of association and disassociation through the Anti-Discrimination Act because we make them associate. But let me tell you, I'll repeat what the founders said. If you want to be persistently vicious with your use of your freedom will be lost. You'll lose your freedom. And that's what happened. Americans lost their freedom of association and disassociation because they would not stop using it to exclude Black Americans from their ability to simply function in the American economy.
So how do things like educational freedom fit into this?
Well, once we get through sort of our survey of Black American history, and at the end, we talk about things that we think affect Black Americans disproportionately, but really affect all Americans, right? Whether that's education, mass incarceration, the drug war, welfare, perverse incentives, and things like that. And so what we say at the end is, let's look at some solutions for any group that is somehow stuck economically, whether they're white or Black or Latino or whatever. And what we say is, there's a couple of things that are just obvious solutions. We talk about criminal justice reform, economic freedom, and then our other big policy solution is educational freedom. And what we see there is that if you know about our history of highways, urban renewal, FHA redlining, it just stacks and stacks and stacks, and also including, of course, the perverse incentives of the welfare state. What you know is that some of our inner cities were literally designed. We socially engineered things in such a way that we left poor Black people behind in the inner city, surrounded by huge concrete walls, those are the highways, separating them from others and economically isolating them in a way that was bound to create the kind of high crime, high poverty, destabilized neighborhoods that we have today. So the idea that we are now going to tie, or we're going to continue tying their access to education to their zip code only adds insult to injury, right? It just perpetuates the injustice of the kind of progressive, massive federal social engineering that went on in the mid-20th century. And so what we want to do is attach that funding to the student, not to the system, allow competition to come into the system so that we can have a lot of creative things to do when we're dealing with a population that's deeply traumatized. We need to be very, very creative when it comes to serving kids who have a chaotic, neighborhood that they're coming from. And we need to come up with really great ways to help them break out of that through new kinds of education. And so we just think truly that educational freedom is the rights issue, the justice issue of our day.
And what about civil society? There's an intersect between that and education, but what role does civil society have to play? And how do we, I don't know if I want to say how do we get it to play that role, but how do we invite it back into the fold?
Yeah, I think the concept of civil society should be front and center for every classical liberal, because if the government's not going to do it, and it's not the kind of thing that the market does, right? The market doesn't do everything. It only does some things. Then it's going to be done by civil society. And it's like Tocqueville said, in England and France, it'll be some lord or some government project, but in America, they start a club. It's in our bones, it's in our blood to solve problems through civil society. So the first thing I say is that we really have to appreciate the incredible tradition of civil society in Black America, most notably in the Black church, but also in the fraternal societies that almost half of Black men were a part of in the early 20th century. They were kind of like a sort of social insurance. Just amazing feats of literacy that were, through the schools that were created through the churches. Really, really amazing things done, not through the state, but through voluntary cooperation. And so now as we look at things like educational freedom and economic freedom, we're looking at destabilized neighborhoods where people are simply cut off from the normal exchange, the normal back and forth of being in a city with others. And so if we are going to invite them into the economy, into participation into the economy, into participation into politics and any other part of our lives, we actually need to bring those networks to them because they were purposefully cut off. And so at the end of the book, we talk about neighborhood stabilization, which is a way of approaching philanthropy that's very hyper-local, face-to-face, driven by love, long-term commitment, and it's bringing resources to the neighborhood so that the vision of the neighbors for their own neighborhood can be empowered, as opposed to the way we often do philanthropy, where we're the superior ones. We know what you need. We're just going to come in and drop it on your head. Well, how well has that worked? It hasn't worked when the government has done it. It hasn't worked when our charities have done it. So we really need to look at not just using civil society, but thinking about what form it needs to take to repair everything that's been lost in these broken neighborhoods.
Can you tell us a bit about your friend Lou, what he's doing and why he's doing what he's doing?
Oh, Lucas. Yeah. Yeah, Lucas is from Love the Lou. So the Lou there stands actually for St. Louis, L-O-U. We call ourselves the Lou. And Lucas is the founder of Love the Lou. And what Lucas did, was a pastor, but he decided that he wanted to sort of be the hands and feet instead of the mouthpiece for Jesus. And so he moved into one of the worst streets in North City of St. Louis, which is the worst area in terms of murder rates and crime and things like that. And he spent about 6 years just gaining the neighbors' trust and getting to know everybody. And then in the last 4 or 5 years has really empowered the neighbors to build 3 beautiful community gardens, to rehab some homes that are now going to be owned by members of the community that are really solid. He calls them persons of peace, people that are kind of anchors within the community. He's got 40 kids that have now graduated high school. These are kids that, would have joined gangs, would have gone to jail. And instead they've got jobs. They're going to college. They're delaying having kids. They're really going down a path that they wouldn't have even dreamt of, 10 years ago, before he was there. And the point was simply to bring our networks in. Lucas was someone who was well networked out among St. Louisans who are better resourced. And he could bring in, if there was somebody who wanted to start a business, he had a business mentor for that person. He can bring kids out to have empowered experiences, to visit a campus or visit a corporation and see all of the possibilities that are in front of them. And so the point of neighborhood stabilization and of what Lucas is doing is that we really have to walk through life with people. That's the only way to repair what's been lost, because all of those things that I go over in chapter 7 and 8 of the book and more have really broken down these cultures in these neighborhoods. The families have been broken down. The economic centers were mowed down to create the highways. So much was destroyed. And you can't send somebody a check in the mail to solve that. And, starting a jobs program doesn't solve that. You have to be with people because their problems are multivarious, right? And so you have to be nimble. You have to be ready to help them in whatever way arises. But you also have to be someone who is saying to them, what's your vision? Help me to carry out your vision, and actually letting people communicate and listening to what they want for their own neighborhood, so that it's not you running the show, but rather them. The only people who are really going to solve the problem in destabilized neighborhoods are the neighbors themselves. It's just that they need to be empowered by people who have better resources and better networks.
So one final question before we go on to the real final question. Can you really quickly give us I don't know if I want to say defense of capitalism, but what do you say to people who say that free markets and capitalism are inherently evil and are evidence to slavery and all of that? Because to me, based on everything we've talked about, it seems the opposite.
Yeah, well, I spent chapter 2 dealing with the new historians of capitalism. And so I do try to show that their analysis is just wrong. In some cases, it's just like mathematically wrong. Like they've just made very simple math mistakes in understanding the role of slavery in the economy. But if I guess I can do a two-parter. I can go back into history and say, look at the South versus the North. The Southern planters were the only ones with wealth. The rest of the society in the South did not have wealth. They weren't any richer than the Northern industrialists. When Frederick Douglass moved up to the North, he was shocked by how well off Northern workers were. Their lives were way, way better than the lives of poor whites in the South. Because why? There's just a better, stronger middle class. And if you look all over today at global capitalism, what you're seeing, and we literally look at Brookings, we've literally just passed this line. Over 50% of the people in the world are middle class within their own economy. So I don't mean they're like an American person who's middle class. I just mean they're neither poor nor rich. They're in the middle. And that is not something that ever existed before the advent of capitalism. You were either a rich nobleman or you were a serf. There wasn't a whole lot in between, right? But the merchant class broke all that up and they broke it open. And because of the innovation of the entrepreneurial class, you can have regular Joe Schmo people living comfortable lives. They're not necessarily rich, but they're not poor. And so that's happening all over the world. And then the distribution of wealth, people are freaking out about inequality because you have a few people who are astronomically rich. But what they should be looking at is distribution. What is the distribution of wealth throughout the economy? And even if you have astronomically rich people, if you have a huge middle class, you've got a nice, stable economy. And that's what you want. That's also more politically peaceful because middle class people don't want to have a revolution. They don't need to burn everything down because they've got a college fund for their kid, And so I think when you look at the results, you can really see that capitalism is incredibly productive, and then it helps out those who are less well off. It's not just for the rich. But I want to temper that by saying this. There's nothing wrong with being on our guard against greed and consumerism. Everybody's greedy, no matter what economic system you're in. But in capitalism, it's true that it's easy to get a little focused on money or stuff. And so I think it's great when you have things like the rise of minimalism, or the fact that millennials are more interested in experiences than in stuff, or the idea that churches are taking during Lent, they're actually fasting from their technology, for the month or whatever, right? I think that's good. That's what civil society is there for. It's to pull back whatever vices we're going to be prone to in the system that we're in. And every system has its own vices. And so could capitalism make you too consumerist? Yeah, it probably could, right? And so we should be our own best critics when it comes to keeping our eye on goodness, truth, and beauty, and not just on shallow stuff.
Awesome. All right. So what is one thing that you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
Well, it's funny. I was going to answer your question actually by going back to our discussion earlier about libertarianism and classical liberalism. When I was in my college years, I was actually an anarcho-capitalist. The idea that you could have this one first principle of private property rights, and that could then, like, everything could be deduced in some sense from that, felt so good to me. It felt clean to me. It felt like geometry almost, like a deduction, right? And so it was very attractive. Dealing with having politics or the state is very messy and annoying. And I liked the idea of just solving everything by contracts. But I ended up, and I was a Lockean at that time when it came to private property rights. But over time, I underwent, I guess, what you might call a conversion. And I became a Humean on property rights, which means I wrote my dissertation on David Hume on property rights. And he has a much more strategic account of the way that property rights arise. And it makes room for the fact that property rights are, to some extent, negotiated in a society. The exact boundaries around them can change. You have things like nuisance law. You have problems like public goods problems and externalities problems. And these are things that have to be solved somehow. And they're complicated and messy because life is complicated and messy, and there isn't always a perfect deductive answer. And so over time, I really gave up on the idea of anarcho-capitalism. I think anarchists can be interesting insofar as they are always contemplating how public goods problems could be privatized. And I think that's great. I hope they continue, because that does happen. And sometimes public goods can be privatized, and they can stop being public goods problems because our technology has caught up or something like that. So that's great. But I'm not going around condemning anyone who believes in a minimal state. I'm not saying that every government that ever existed is illegitimate. I'm not defining myself in terms of my hatred of the state. What I love is freedom and liberty. And liberty is something that flourishes when it's ordered, when it has the correct kinds of boundaries around it. And that simply does require the messy process of politics, no matter how much it can frustrate us that it does. And so that's probably been one of my biggest shifts.
Once again, I'd like to thank my guest for their time and insight, and I'd like to thank you for listening to the Great Antidote podcast. The Great Antidote is sound engineered by Rich Goyette. If you have any questions, any guests or topic recommendations, please feel free to reach out to me at thegreatantidote@gmail.com. Thank you.